Burkina Faso was one of the world's poorest countries, with 80% of its population lacking access to electricity. Western advisors recommended coal and natural gas power plants, costing billions of dollars. But Ibrahim Traoré chose a completely different path. The sun is our petroleum. This energy revolution that began with this simple sentence would transform Burkina Faso from an electricity importer to an exporter within 3 years and change the energy future of all Africa. The meeting room in Burkina Faso's Ministry of Energy was filled to capacity. International Energy Consultants Development Bank representatives and ministry officials gathered around a large table covered with technical reports, financial projections, and proposed contracts. The atmosphere was tense as presentations concluded and all eyes turned to President Ibrahim Traoré, who had listened quietly for the past 3 hours. The lead consultant, representing a consortium of Western energy companies, summarized their proposal. Mr. President, our analysis clearly shows that Burkina Faso's energy needs require a mixed approach. A 500-megawatt coal plant near Ouagadougou, natural gas facilities in regional centers, and limited solar for remote areas. Implementation would cost approximately $4.2 billion, financed through our partner banks with a 30-year repayment structure. Traoré studied the documents before him. His expression unreadable. The country's energy crisis was undeniable. Only 17% of Burkina Faso's population had access to reliable electricity in rural areas. That figure dropped below 5% without electricity. Economic development stagnated. Healthcare facilities couldn't function properly, and educational opportunities remained limited. After a long moment of silence, Traoré asked a question that would later be recognized as the beginning of a national transformation. How much sunlight does Burkina Faso receive annually compared to European countries? The consultant seemed confused by this apparent tangent. Well, approximately 3 times the solar irradiation of Germany, for instance. But Germany is currently one of the world leaders in solar energy production. Correct. True. Interrupted. Yes. But their infrastructure and financing capabilities are entirely different. Traoré raised his hand, silencing the consultant. He stood and walked to the large map of Burkina Faso, displayed on the wall for decades. We have been told that our country is poor in resources, that we must import energy at great expense, that we must borrow billions we cannot repay to build infrastructure we cannot maintain. He pointed to the vast northern regions of the country, where the Sahel transitions into the Sahara Desert. Yet we possess one of the world's most abundant resources. Sunlight, nearly 3,000 hours of intense sunlight every year falling freely on our land. Turning back to the assembled experts, Traoré's voice took on a new intensity. The sun is our petroleum. The sun is our coal. The sun is our natural gas. And unlike those resources, no one can own it, control it, or sell it to us at inflated prices. With that statement, he closed the folder containing the Western Consortium's proposal. Thank you for your presentation. Burkina Faso will be pursuing a different approach to its energy future. The consultants exchanged concerned glances as Traoré continued. Minister Euro will outline our new national solar initiative in the coming weeks. We welcome partnerships that align with this vision, but we will not mortgage our future on fossil fuel dependencies. As the international visitors filed out, many dismissed Traoré's position as naive idealism, a political statement disconnected from energy realities. How could one of the world's poorest countries possibly solve its energy crisis through solar power alone, without the massive financing packages they had proposed? What they didn't realize was that Traoré's announcement wasn't an impulsive rejection, but the culmination of months of quiet preparation and planning. For the previous 6 months, a small team of Burkinabe engineers, economists, and energy specialists had been developing a radically different approach to the country's energy challenges. 2 days after the meeting, Traoré convened his cabinet to unveil this alternative vision. Salif Ouedraogo, the newly appointed Minister of Energy Transformation, presented the core of what would become known as the distributed solar network strategy. Our traditional approach to electrification has followed colonial models: centralized generation, expensive transmission infrastructure, and gradual expansion from urban centers outward. Ouedraogo explained this approach requires enormous upfront capital, creates dependency on fuel imports, and takes decades to reach rural communities using a series of maps and simple diagrams. He outlined a fundamentally different model. Instead of a few large power plants, we proposed thousands of microgrids, solar generation, and storage systems scaled to serve individual communities directly. The strategy had 3 interconnected components. First, a village energy independence program would install solar microgrids in 2,000 rural communities within 18 months. Each system would be designed to power essential services water pumping, health clinics, schools, and basic household needs. Second, a solar manufacturing initiative would establish domestic production of panels, batteries, and components, creating jobs while reducing import costs. Third, a regional solar exchange would ultimately connect these systems into a flexible grid, allowing energy trading between communities and eventually neighboring countries. The total cost is approximately one-third of the Western proposal. Ouedraogo concluded implementation time is measured in months rather than years, and critically, the technology and maintenance can be managed at the local level, creating sustainable employment throughout the country. Cabinet reaction was mixed. The finance minister raised immediate concerns. Where will we find even this reduced funding? Our national budget cannot support such an initiative without external loans, Traoré had anticipated. This question to sources first. We will redirect fuel subsidies that currently consume 8% of our national budget, subsidies that primarily benefit the urban elite with vehicles and generators. Second, we will use a portion of our newly renegotiated mining revenues. This last point referenced Traoré's recent overhaul of contracts with foreign mining companies operating in Burkina Faso, which had increased government revenue substantially. The health minister was supportive but practical. Our rural clinics desperately need reliable electricity for refrigeration equipment and nighttime operations. How quickly could those be prioritized? Health facilities are first priority. Ouedraogo confirmed we can deploy initial systems to clinics within 3 months of program initiation. After hours of discussion, the cabinet approved the proposal, though several ministers remained skeptical. This skepticism was mild compared to the international reaction that followed Trump's public announcement of the initiative. The following week, Western energy experts were dismissive, with one World Bank consultant commenting to international media, "Solar has a place in Africa's energy mix, but the scale and speed proposed by Burkina Faso is simply unrealistic. You cannot power a developing economy on sunshine alone." Oil and gas companies, which had hoped to develop new markets in West Africa, were more directly critical. A French energy conglomerate issued a statement warning that pursuing intermittent power sources without adequate baseload generation will create instability and ultimately harm economic development. Even some environmental organizations expressed concerns about the ambition of the timeline and the absence of Western technical partners in the plan. Traoré responded to these criticisms with characteristic directness. During a press conference, "For decades, we have been told to wait for development to arrive from outside, to accept debt for infrastructure that primarily benefits foreign companies and urban elites. This time, we will determine our own energy future, using resources we already possess in abundance." Implementation began immediately, focusing first on demonstrating quick, visible successes. The village of Cumbri, which had never had electricity despite being just 40 kilometers from the capital, was selected as the first installation site. Rather than following conventional development approaches, bringing in foreign contractors with imported equipment, the project employed a distinctive methodology. A team of 10 Burkina Faso engineers who had received solar training in Morocco and India led the installation. They trained 20 local residents in basic system construction and maintenance, creating immediate employment while ensuring the community could support the technology long-term. The entire Cumbri installation was completed in just 2 weeks. A 50-kilowatt solar array with battery storage sufficient to power the village health clinic, school, community center, and public lighting. The system was intentionally modular, designed to expand as resources permitted and demand grew. The day electricity flowed for the first time in Cumbri became a national media event. Children who had never seen electric lights gathered in the school to study after sunset. The health clinic began refrigerating vaccines and operating essential medical equipment. Small businesses extended their hours, increasing productivity and income. Most powerfully, the community itself took immediate ownership of the system. The trained local technicians proudly demonstrated their knowledge, explaining to visitors how the equipment worked and how they would maintain it. This wasn't a development project given to the community. It was their system, built partly by their own hands. "This is not merely about providing electricity," Traoré said during a visit to Cumbri 1 month after installation. "This is about energy sovereignty, the ability of communities to generate and manage their own power, independent of distant utilities or imported fuels." As the Cumbri model proved successful, implementation accelerated. Teams of engineers and technicians, growing in number as the training program expanded, deployed systems to new communities weekly. Each installation refined the process, reducing costs and implementation time. 6 months into the initiative, 200 villages had functioning microgrids. Health officials reported immediate improvements in rural healthcare, vaccines properly refrigerated, Medical equipment, operational childbirth, no longer conducted by flashlight schools, extended learning hours into evenings, small businesses emerged around the new energy access charging services for mobile phones, refrigeration for produce, electric, grain grinding, yet challenges remained substantial battery storage technology. Essential for nighttime power represented nearly 40% of system costs. Supply chains for components were still predominantly international, creating vulnerability to pricing and availability fluctuations. Maintenance in the most remote installations proved difficult during rainy seasons, when roads became impassable. The most significant challenge, however, came from entrenched interests threatened by the new approach. The national utility company, which had long enjoyed a monopoly despite its failure to serve most of the population, resisted the decentralized model. Foreign fuel suppliers saw potential markets evaporating. Development banks, accustomed to financing large infrastructure projects with generous terms for Western contractors, questioned the program's sustainability without their involvement. These pressures came to a head 9 months into the initiative, when the International Monetary Fund raised concerns about Burkina Faso's redirection of fuel subsidies to the solar program in a sharply worded assessment. They suggested this policy shift could destabilize budgetary frameworks and recommended returning to conventional energy development. Pathways Trousers' response was firm. We respect the IMF's expertise in many areas, but Burkina Faso's energy future will be determined in Ouagadougou, not Washington. The subsidies we have redirected were supporting imported fuel that benefited few citizens. Now they support energy generation that serves entire communities. This exchange captured international attention, positioning Burkina Faso's solar initiative within broader debates about development autonomy and resource sovereignty. Energy analysts began studying the program more seriously, and something unexpected emerged from their assessments. The approach was working, and at a pace that conventional development models couldn't match. 1 year into implementation, independent evaluations confirmed that 500 communities had functioning microgrids providing reliable electricity to approximately 1.2 million people who previously had none. The cost per connection was proving to be less than one-third of conventional grid extension system. Reliability exceeded expectations, with properly maintained installations achieving 99.1% uptime. Most surprisingly, 2 international observers, the employment impact was substantial. The program had created over 5,000 direct jobs in installation and maintenance, plus thousands more in the emerging ecosystem of businesses utilizing the new energy access. Unlike extractive industries that concentrated wealth, these jobs were distributed throughout the country, creating economic activity in previously marginalized regions. These results attracted different kinds of international attention. Delegations from neighboring Mali, Niger, and Ghana came to study the model. South cooperation expanded with technical exchanges between Burkina Faso and India, Morocco, and Bangladesh, countries with their own innovative approaches to rural electrification. As the program entered its second year, Traoré pushed for the next phase: domestic manufacturing in partnership with technical universities and with targeted technology transfer agreements. Burkina Faso established its first solar panel assembly facility in an industrial zone outside Ouagadougou. Every panel we import represents value leaving our economy, Traoré explained during the facility's inauguration. Every panel we produce represents value captured locally, skills developed, and capabilities enhanced. The facility began modestly assembling components manufactured elsewhere, but with a clear pathway to increasing local content. Students from technical schools received specialized training, creating a pipeline of skilled workers. Research partnerships focused on adapting designs to specific local conditions, higher temperatures, dust challenges, and transportation limitations. By the midpoint of the second year, domestic assembly was meeting 30% of the program's panel requirements. Battery production remained a greater challenge, but even their assembly of component systems had begun with plans for more comprehensive manufacturing. As scale increased, the distributed nature of the program created resilience that centralized systems lacked. When unusually heavy rains caused flooding in the country's southwest, affecting several installations, nearby communities shared power through temporary connections until repairs could be completed. This adaptability contrasted sharply with conventional grid systems, where single points of failure could black out entire regions. 2 years into implementation, the National Solar Initiative had reached a critical milestone. 1,000 community installations completed, serving approximately 40% of previously unelectrified rural population. Health Ministry data showed measurable improvements in rural healthcare outcomes, particularly in maternal health, where nighttime deliveries no longer carried the additional risks of inadequate lighting. International Perceptions were shifting as well. The African Development Bank, initially skeptical, published a case study highlighting the program's cost-effectiveness and rapid implementation. Energy policy journals began featuring analyses of the Burkina model of distributed generation. Even some Western energy companies, recognizing the changing landscape, sought partnerships aligned with the decentralized approach rather than continuing to push conventional fossil fuel solutions. As the third year began, the initiative entered its most ambitious phase: interconnection. While each microgrid functioned independently, the original vision included eventually linking these systems into a flexible network that could share power across regions. This phase involves sophisticated technical challenges, synchronizing independent systems, developing appropriate load balancing protocols, creating fair compensation mechanisms for energy sharing. Yet it also offered extraordinary potential benefits. Connected systems required less overall storage capacity, as production variations could be balanced across larger areas. Maintenance became more efficient, as neighboring systems could provide backup during repairs, utilizing open-source energy management software developed through a collaboration between Burkina Faso programmers and international experts. The first regional interconnections linked 20 village systems into a mini-grid covering 3 districts in the central region. This prototype demonstrated the concept's viability and provided valuable data for larger-scale implementation. By the middle of the third year, something remarkable became apparent in the country's energy balance calculations. The combined generating capacity of the distributed solar network had exceeded the nation's baseline consumption requirements. For the first time in its history, Burkina Faso was producing more electricity than it consumed. This milestone created an unprecedented opportunity. Mali and Niger, neighboring countries facing similar energy challenges, had begun implementing their own versions of the distributed solar model. Though at earlier stages, through diplomatic engagement, Traoré proposed a regional energy exchange, a framework for electricity trading across borders using interconnected microgrids in border regions. The proposal represented a revolutionary approach to regional energy integration, not massive transmission lines connecting distant centralized plants, but an organic network of community-level systems growing together across borders. The agreement, signed in Ouagadougou with representatives from 5 neighboring countries, established the West African Solar Exchange Cooperative. 10 years after Traoré's declaration that the sun is our petroleum, Burkina Faso had achieved what many experts had deemed impossible. Over 80% of the country's electricity was generated from solar sources. More than 1,800 community microgrids provided power to 3.5 million previously unelectrified citizens. Domestic manufacturing supplied 60% of new system components, and most remarkably, the country had begun exporting electricity to neighboring nations. The economic impacts extended far beyond the energy sector itself. A study by the University of Ouagadougou documented the emergence of over 0 small businesses directly enabled by new energy access, from phone charging services to refrigerated goods, from electronic repairs to media production. Agricultural productivity increased in electrified areas through improved irrigation pumping and crop processing. Evening educational programs allowed adults to develop new skills while maintaining daytime farming or other work. In a special address marking the 3rd anniversary of the National Solar Initiative, Traoré reflected on the program's significance. Energy independence is not merely a technical achievement, but a precondition for true sovereignty. A nation dependent on others for its most basic power needs remains vulnerable to external control and exploitation. He continued, addressing the broader implications. What we have demonstrated is not just that Africa can solve its energy challenges differently, but that our approach may actually be better suited to our conditions than models imported from elsewhere. Distributed renewable, community-centered power is not a compromise or temporary solution. It is the most resilient, sustainable, and democratically aligned system for our context. International energy discourse had shifted substantially. The Burkina model was being studied in university programs and policy centers. Worldwide development organizations began reassessing their approach to energy projects in similar contexts. Even fossil fuel companies adjusted their strategies for African markets, recognizing that distributed renewable systems had demonstrated advantages that conventional approaches couldn't match. In many settings, perhaps most significantly, the project had transformed how Burkina Faso citizens viewed their country's development potential. The narrative of dependency and scarcity had given way to one of resourcefulness and abundance. Communities that had been told they would wait decades for grid connection were now generating their own power, managing their own systems, and in some cases selling surplus electricity to the national network. We were always told that we lacked resources, reflected Mariamo, a technician who had been trained through the program and now supervised 7 village installations. But the truth is that the sun gives us more energy each day than we could possibly use. We just needed to develop the capacity to capture it. This shift in perspective extended to other development challenges. Villages that had successfully implemented and managed their energy systems began applying similar community-led approaches to water management. Agricultural cooperatives and local governance innovations agency replaced dependency as communities recognized their capacity to address challenges directly rather than waiting for solutions from distant authorities. For years after the initiatives launched, Burkina Faso hosted the first Pan-African Distributed Energy Summit, welcoming delegations from 26 African nations. The gathering focused not on abstract policy discussions, but on practical knowledge sharing, installation techniques, maintenance, protocols, financing mechanisms, and governance structures that had proven effective in real-world implementations. What we are building is not just an energy system, but a new development paradigm, Traoré told the assembled delegates, one that places resources and decisions in the hands of communities rather than centralizing them in distant capitals or corporate headquarters, one that builds capacity and resilience from the ground up rather than imposing solutions from above. The summit concluded with the formation of the African Renewable Energy Alliance, a cooperative framework for technology sharing, coordinated manufacturing, development, and cross-border energy trading. Significantly, the alliance structure explicitly centered African expertise and ownership, positioning international partners as collaborators rather than directing entities. 5 years after Traoré had pointed to the sun and declared it our petroleum, the transformation was irrefutable. Burkina Faso had achieved over 90% electrification, up from 17% before the initiative. The distributed solar network comprised over 2,500 interconnected microgrids with a combined capacity exceeding 1.5 gigawatt. Domestic manufacturing supplied 75% of system components, creating a new industrial sector with export potential to neighboring countries, implementing similar models. Most remarkably, Burkina Faso had become a net electricity exporter, with interconnections to Mali, Niger, and Ghana, facilitating regional power trading. The country earned approximately $40 million annually from these exports, a modest sum by global standards, but deeply significant for a nation previously dependent on energy imports. The social and economic impacts were equally profound. Rural to urban migration slowed as economic opportunities emerged in previously marginalized regions. Healthcare outcomes improved dramatically in areas where clinics now had reliable power for equipment, refrigeration, and communications. Educational achievement rose as students gained evening study hours and access to digital learning resources. A World Bank assessment, initially skeptical of the approach, concluded the distributed renewable energy model pioneered by Burkina Faso has achieved in 5 years what conventional electrification strategies would require decades to accomplish at a fraction of the capital investment. The approach merits serious consideration as a primary strategy rather than a complementary approach in similar contexts. For Ibrahim Traoré, the initiative's success validated a core philosophy that guided his leadership, that African nations could chart development pathways aligned with their specific conditions rather than following models designed for different contexts, that apparently limited resources could become abundant through appropriate technologies and approaches, that sovereignty in critical sectors created foundations for broader self-determination. Energy is not merely technical infrastructure. He often reminded his ministers it is the foundation upon which modern societies function. Those who control a nation's energy control much of its future. True independence requires energy sovereignty. This perspective increasingly resonated across the continent as other nations observed Burkina Faso's transformation. Tanzania, Kenya, and Mozambique initiated large-scale distributed renewable programs adapted from the Burkina model. Regional power integration through interconnected microgrids expanded across West Africa. Domestic manufacturing capabilities developed through South-South cooperation rather than dependence on Western technology transfers. 6 years after the fateful meeting where Traoré had rejected the Western Consortium's fossil fuel proposal, he hosted a very different gathering of energy stakeholders. Representatives from African governments, technical universities, manufacturing cooperatives, and community energy associations convened to formalize the African Energy Sovereignty Initiative, a continent-wide framework for collaborative development of renewable energy systems designed specifically for African contexts and controlled by African institutions, what began as a national solution to an urgent need, has evolved into something more significant, Trey told the assembled delegates. A demonstration that Africa's energy future need not replicate paths taken elsewhere, that our abundant resources, sun, wind, ingenuity, community, cohesion can be harnessed through approaches aligned with our own conditions and values. That energy sovereignty is both possible and essential for true independence. The journey from one of the world's least electrified nations to a regional renewable energy leader had not been without challenges and setbacks. Technical difficulties, resource limitations, institutional resistance, and external pressures had created obstacles at every stage, yet the fundamental vision, distributed, renewable, community-centered energy as a path to sovereignty and development, had proven not merely viable, but transformative as solar panels glinted across the landscape of Burkina Faso from village microgrids. Two larger installations near urban centers, they represented more than an energy solution. They embodied a broader principle that Trump had articulated from the beginning, that Africa's most abundant resources were not those that required extraction and export, but those freely available to all sunlight, innovation, and the collective capacity of communities to build their own future. The international energy establishment, which had initially dismissed Burkina Faso's approach as naive idealism, disconnected from reality now, studied the Burkina model as a potential paradigm shift in how developing regions could address energy challenges. The conventional wisdom that poor countries required expensive, centralized fossil fuel infrastructure financed through international debt had been fundamentally challenged by a different pathway: decentralized, renewable, community managed systems built incrementally with a focus on local control and capacity development. The sun is our petroleum, Trump had declared at the beginning of this journey. 6 years later, this simple statement had evolved from a hopeful vision to demonstrated reality, not just for Burkina Faso, but increasingly for the continent it had inspired.